Good. And maybe you want to mute everybody except for me. Maybe that's an idea. Or should I try to do that?
We're all good. I think we're all good.
Mute all, but I allow... Okay, I've muted everybody just to cut out background, barking dogs and various other noises. But if you wish to make a comment or add to the shir, please feel free to unmute yourself in the course of the shir. Learning Mesillat Yesharim is, for me, always a very exciting and meaningful sefer. It brings me back to my yeshiva days, and ever since, Mesillat Yesharim plays once a person has familiarized themselves with this particular sefer, it becomes part of your life, because the sefer is designed in such a way, even though it's written 300 years ago, it's still very appealing to the modern mind. And as I mentioned to you last week, just to summarize for 1 minute what we looked at last week, he starts off in chapter 1 by speaking about getting some clarity about chovoso ba'olamo. What is a person's goal in life? Do you have any sort of spiritual goal in your mind which you want to try and achieve? The idea of, as is common today in all business management programs, to devise some sort of a mission statement about what really are you aiming at. Because one thing is certain, if one doesn't know what one's aiming at, it's unlikely to achieve it. And the idea of the very first line of the Mesillat Yesharim, clarifying one's purpose in life, as we see through the book, what he wants to get us to understand is that the worst sort of life for the Mesillat Yesharim is a life which a person leads with what he calls hergel. We'll come to that, please God, more in the next chair. But the idea of hergel means living a life by habit, living an unthinking life, living a life which is what you might call on autopilot. You're just doing what you're doing day by day, responding and reacting to all the situations around you, but without really having a spiritual focus in your life, without really feeling there is something I really want to achieve with my life. That is the first principle that we spoke about last week. And this is something which we're going to be coming back to in general throughout the Mesillat Yesharim. If I had to big picture with the Mesillat Yesharim, he comes back again and again to this dichotomy. There are people who live with what he calls hergel, on autopilot, and there are people who live with hitbonanut, with people who live reflectively. They examine their life. They are thinking about what they are achieving in life spiritually, and what are they achieving in life in terms of the values of life, where they're going to, and what they would like to spiritually achieve. And that is the big difference. That's the first big difference that he wants us to understand. And in order to understand that, ma chovoso ba'olamo, to understand what is your unique role in life. I'd like to just give this a little bit of a Rosh Hashanah angle for a moment, as we are a couple of days before Rosh Hashanah, and that is that the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Tes Zayin, who tells us that Rosh Hashanah is Yom Hadin, right? The Pasuk doesn't tell us that Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment. The Pasuk only tells us that Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Teruah. But in Teresh Baal Peh, in the Mishnah Maseches Rosh Hashanah, we are told that Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Hadin, and the language that the Mishnah uses is Rosh Hashanah kol bo'ei olam ovrim lefonov kibnei moron. That all the people in the world, they pass before HaKadosh Baruch Hu kibnei moron. Now, bnei moron is a very strange word, and I won't go into the whole subject. But bnei moron, the simple translation means sheep. But why did the Mishnah write that? Why did the Mishnah not write? Right? Why did the Mishnah not write that on Rosh Hashanah everybody passes before HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'mishpat or badim? Why does it say over mefanu kibnei moron? And the author of the famous piyut of Onusane Teikef also quotes this Mishnah and says, "Malachim yechafezun v'chilo odom yochezun v'yomer hine yom adin, but v'kol boy olam over mefanu kibnei moron." So the Maharal has got a very interesting angle on this. And he actually relates to the Gemara on Daf Yud Ches in Rosh Hashanah, which says that it's true that the simple translation of B'nai Moron means like sheep. But actually, the Gemara there says that B'nai Moron means something else completely. It refers to a mountain pass in the Galil. In the Galil, where most of the Tanoim lived, right? There were mountains, and there were no roads like there are today. So to get from one side of the mountain to the other, there was a very, very narrow pass with a sharp drop on the side, and only one person at a time could pass by there. Says the Maharal, this is a metaphor for the idea that people are judged on Rosh Hashanah according to their own singular uniqueness. In other words, it's true a person is judged for mitzvahs and aveiros, that's one thing. But the other thing is, what have you done with your unique talents, your unique connections, your unique abilities, your unique neshama? Every person is spiritually a unique individual, and therefore is judged, B'nai Moron, says the Maharal, that is judged according to what his or her unique potential is. And that's something Mesillat Yesharim is very interested in. The chovoso ba'olamai of the chapter 1. I'd like to move on today within chapter 1 and get a little bit of a taste of what how the Mesillat Yesharim, how Rabbi Moshe Haim Luzzatto develops this theme. Just bear with me for 1 second. Right. So I've got some text here we're going to look at together. Let's see if I can get this up. Mesillat Yesharim. Right. Okay, can you see, Avi, Ami, can you see a text? Yes, good, excellent. Avi can also see a text, excellent. So the Mesillat Yesharim starts off in general terms, and actually he uses a pasuk from the Mizmor of Tehillim that we are saying this time of year, L'Doved Hashem Ori V'Yishi. And in that Mizmor, there is one pasuk, famous pasuk, Achas Sha'alti Me'is Hashem Osa Avakesh. That actually, even though, what does it mean, David HaMelech says, I only asked from HaKadosh Baruch Hu one thing. What does that mean? David HaMelech asked from HaKadosh Baruch Hu 1,000 things. He was the king of Israel. He asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu to help him run the country, help him win the wars, help him set up the economy, help him run his family. He was asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for a million different things. But what he's saying here is, Achas sha'olti me'is Hashem osa avakesh, that all the things that I ask for are really only in order to achieve one goal. And that's what the Mesillat Yesharim here is going to look at. If you look a bit more closely at this idea, you will see that actually whatever we are doing in life should be an opportunity for a moment of getting close to HaKadosh Baruch, a moment of what he calls deveikus, right? And this word deveikus, right, appears, of course, in Sefer Devarim, V'atem hadveikim b'Hashem Elokeichem, Chaim kulchem hayom. Moshe Rabbeinu tells Klal Yisrael the ultimate goal of Torah and mitzvahs is to reach a type of deveikus. It's difficult to define exactly what deveikus means, right? The Gedolei HaChasidus took the word deveikus to mean a certain type of spiritual ecstasy, a type of raised consciousness of a person reaching a peak moment of simcha and celebration, and that is dveikus. In actual fact, dveikus means a closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Dovek is the strongest form, the strongest word of two people relating to each other. In fact, the very first time it's used in the Torah, it's used to describe the relationship between Adam and Chava. Right? Al-Kain Yazav Ishas Daviv Imo V'Dovak Be'ishta. The pasuk says in Bereshis chapter 2 that the link between a husband and wife should be one of deveikus, right? So we are now, the Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Devarim says that our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be a dveikus connection. But the Mesillat Yesharim is saying that every mitzvah in life, every moment in life, could be an opportunity for dveikus. And that's what he says here. For who Masha Yadover Hamelech Omer Achas Sha'alti Meis Hashem Osa Avakesh Shivti Beveis Hashem Kol Yemei Chaya Ki Rak Zeh Hu Hatov. This is really the only definition we have of the ultimate purpose in life. Generally speaking, he's going to go a bit more into detail, is to use our life to attain a type of dveikus, a type of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And of course, in particular, when we are davening or learning Torah or involved in a mitzvah, whether it's sitting in the sukkah, every mitzvah that we have is another angle, another opportunity to have a moment of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that moment, and coming back to what we spoke about last week, the Mesillat Yesharim is very concerned that one should not only do the mitzvah, but that one should have a ta'anug, one should have an enjoyment of the mitzvah. If you remember last week, I discussed the idea that the Mesillat Yesharim speaks about, that part of the spiritual message of the Torah is that human beings can derive pleasure purely from physical enjoyments, from types of food and types of relationships and types of experiences, physical experiences, or they can derive pleasure from certain spiritual experiences. And the spiritual experiences are not, it's not a type of pleasure which is self-serving or egoistic or self-centered. It is a type of a transcendental pleasure, a sense of connecting to Netzach, connecting to the Ein Sof. That pleasure of spirituality that one can get occasionally during a davening, if you have a good tefillah, Bez Hashem, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, on Yom Tov, and you have a good shliach tzibur, maybe you sing a few good nigunim, and you understand some of the words, you can have in your davening some moments of dveikus. And he says that's really, these moments are actually the ultimate goal. And in a sense, at the end of one's life, you simply count up all the moments of dveikus in your life, and that's what you lived for. That's really ultimately what a person has lived for, to maximize that dveikus. And that's what David HaMelech says. Of course, I want to fight battles and win the battles. Of course, I want to arrange the economy of the nation and the security of the nation and his family and his succession and everything. But all of it is only in order to reach a level of dveikus and to reach a moment of Kvod Shamayim. I was actually thinking about this recently. I was Masada Kiddushin, as I've done Baruch Hashem many times, certainly over 100 times in my life. Masada Kiddushin just recently, and I was thinking all the brachas under the chuppah, a bracha samach to samach re'im ahuvim, I would bless the chosen and kala, avo achva shalom bereyos, and all the wonderful blessings we give to the chosen and kala under the chuppah. But what is the first bracha that we make under the chuppah? So you will tell me Bara Priya Gofen, but that's not actually halachically true. The first bracha that we make is Shahakoil Bara Lichvod. That's the first bracha, which got nothing to do with Chassid and Kala. It's actually got nothing to do with the chuppah. It is the most general statement about the purpose of our life, that everything that we have in this life is in order to reach level of Kavod Shamayim, to do something which brings us closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is Baruch to Hashem. After you have said Shakal Bara Lechvodo, then you can talk about the Chosan and the Kala and the Mechutanim and the Simcha and the Ava and the Reyos. Everything else is simply really the detailing how the Kvod Shamayim is being increased. And that really is also Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the year. And what do we speak about on Rosh Hashanah? We don't say vidui on Rosh Hashanah, and we don't ask for good health. We don't ask for good health. We don't ask for parnasa. What we do on Rosh Hashanah is say everything that we want to do in life is for Hamelech HaKadosh. That's it. And then if you say that on Rosh Hashanah with Kavanah, then the rest of the year really is the details of this a mission statement. That's really a part of what the Mesillat Yesharim wants us to understand. So he says here, Omlam l'chashay yizkeh. I'm reading in the Hebrew, if you want to follow in the English, Omlam l'chashay yizkeh odem l'tova azos, in order to attain this great good, in other words, this great goal of Dveikus, Ro'u sheyamal rishona of yishtadol b'yosel l'knesa. HaKadosh Baruch Hu put us in a world where it doesn't come easily. It has to take place, what he says, with omol, sheya'amol, ya'amol means hard work, and hishtadlut, right, with effort, b'yigiosa, liknosa. You have to make a kinyan. You only acquire something with a bit of self-sacrifice. If you give up a little bit of your comforts, a little bit of your assets, so you give up something, then you can acquire it. Then you have bought it, so to speak, right? So this Dveikus needs to be acquired. V'hainu, says the Ramchal, sheyishtadel lidobek b'yisparach b'koach maisim, sheteldosa mzehu inyan, to put effort into those actions which can bring about this Dveikus. And what are they? The Haim mitzvahs. As he wants us to get a new perspective on mitzvahs. We are not just doing mitzvahs because God wants us to. That's also true. We say, there's a tzivui Hashem, you've got to keep Shabbos, you've got to eat kosher, right? You've got to sit in a sukkah, you're going to blow the shofar. We're doing the mitzvahs because that's our obligation. Says the Mesillat Yesharim, I want you to now look at it differently. From now on, every mitzvah should be seen through the perspective of how is this mitzvah going to give me a little bit more of a feeling of Dveikus, a little bit more of a feeling of closeness to our Kadosh Baruch. And this is a completely different perspective on life. And it's actually interesting, if we go back in the introduction to the Sefer, the Mesillat Yesharim writes, I'm going to be telling you lots of things that you know already. And in fact, the whole point of Musa is to take ideas that everybody knows, or every thinking person or every learned person knows, but really puts shelves in your mind and puts them aside, and you don't live with it. The idea of Musa is to take ideas that you know already and to live with them, to apply them on a daily basis. And that's what Musa was about. I remember listening, I had the zechus for many years to listen to the Musa Droshus of Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz in the Mir Yeshiva in the 1970s. I was in the Mir Yeshiva for about 5 years in the 1970s with Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz. I heard his Gemara shiurim were unbelievable shiurim, but his Musa Shmuzim were amazing. But he used to say, Musa, the Musa Shmuz that I'm saying, he used to say them over and over, the same talk. Every 2 or 3 years, he would say over the Shmuz again and again. Some of you might have the Sefer Sichas Musa or Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz, right? You'll see there's only 3 years of Sichas Musa there, even though he gave these shurim for about 30 years. Why are there only 3 years of them? Because these 3 years of Drosh, he gave them again and again. He said that Musa is about reminding yourself and internalizing it and coming back to it again and again, because the human being has a tendency to forget certain principles of life. So that's what the Mesillat Yesharim is about. That's an amazing thing. The Mesillat Yesharim is there as a very small sefer. I said to you last week, one of the very attractive, among the many attractive features of the Mesillat Yesharim is that it's a short book. It's not very long, but it's ma'at hakamus v'rav ha'ichus. It's got small quantity but a massive quality, and it has inspired millions of people over the last 3 centuries to think more deeply about what we're doing when we are leading a Jewish life. And this is, so the first thing is, he says, to understand that there is a purpose of Chavosa B'Olamo. The second thing is to understand that in some way that connects to how are we going to achieve moments of Dveikus in our life. I say moments because Gedolei Yisrael, great tzaddikim, live a life of constant Dveikus. But I think for people like you and me, I think it's not realistic to speak about living a life of constant Dveikus. It's difficult for us to have Dveikus while we're eating our Weetabix or our cornflakes in the morning, right? Or while we are stuck in a traffic jam and getting annoyed. It's very difficult to be in a state of dveikus. But we can have moments of dveikus. When you're doing a mitzvah, you're holding your lulav, focus on it for a minute. Don't just do it quickly. Focus on it for a minute. Think about the meaning of it, the purpose of it, and allow yourself to understand that this is a moment of kirvat Hashem. And the same is true when you're making kiddush on Friday night. The same is true when you're learning a mishnah or a pasuk with one of your kids or one of your grandchildren. You're engaging in activities of infinite value, not finite value, infinite value, right? And that should give you a sense of dveikus and a sense of pleasure. And then you're on the escalator. Then you're in Kita Aleph. For the Moshe Haim Luzzatto has put you in Kita Aleph. You get it. You've got the vocabulary. You know what we're talking about. This is what spiritual growth is about in Torah life, says the Rabbi Moshe Haim Luzzatto, is to try and get into that learning curve where you will increasingly find moments of dveikus in your life and understand that Achash Alti Meis Hashem, that's really what you're looking for in general. Now let's move on to the next point that he makes here. We're still all in the first chapter, you understand. He's got more than 20 chapters in this book, but we're still in the first chapter. But it's in this chapter he lays down the yesodus, so the foundations. And here he's going to be talking about the general principle of what we usually call bechira. Bechira means free choice. Interestingly, he doesn't use that word. Instead of the word bechira, he prefers to use the word nisayon. Nisayon means that a person is being tested. I think it's very interesting that he chooses this word. The Rambam, for example, in Hilchos Tshuva, focuses very much on the principle of bechira. For the Rambam, the idea of having a free choice, being able to choose freely how to lead your life, is connected to the word bechira. Incidentally, why does the Rambam choose the word bechira? Because of this week's parsha. In Parshas Nitzavim, towards the end, is one of my most favorite all-time psukim in the whole Chumash. There's a pasuk which says, "Ha'idosi b'chem hayom es hashamayim v'es aretz." Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, "I call to testify shamayim v'aretz." Right? "Hachayim v'hamoves nosati lefonecha." I'm giving you a choice in life between life and death. Right? Habrocha v'haklala. You can either choose a life of bracha or chas v'shalom, the opposite. Uvocharta b'chayim. Vocharta b'chayim. At the end of chapter 30, the end of Nistavim. Moshe Rabbeinu says, do me a favor, make the right choice. It's very passionate. Don't forget, this is the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life. The last day of his life, he turns to Klal Yisrael and says, look, I've been teaching you guys Torah for 40 years. I took you to Har Sinai, I took you through the Midbar, I've taught you everything in the Torah. And now is the last day of my life. Do me a favor, uvocharta b'chayim. Choose life. And what he's saying is, you've got the bechira. The word livchar means to choose different paths of life. We all have choices all the time in our life. And Moshe Rabbeinu says of V'charta b'chayim, and that is a beautiful, emotional moment in Nitzavim, or is it like begging the Klal Yisrael, make the right decisions, right? And so the Rambam uses the word bechira because that's the Lashon HaMikra. Interestingly, the Mesillat Yesharim prefers the word nisayon, because the word nisayon is a bit more of a powerful word in the sense that nisayon means you are being tested, right? In every situation, let's have a look what he says about a nisayon. Are you with me? Says the text as follows: V'hinei, we're still in the first chapter of the Mesillat Yesharim. V'hinei somoy HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'adam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has placed an individual b'makom, in a place sherabim bo hamarchikim osam emera yisparach, where there are many distractions. There are many forces at play in this world who are going to derail a person from attaining dveikus, from reaching his goals, spiritual goals in life. There are so many different factors in this world, whether they are economic factors or political factors or health factors or social factors, all sorts of different factors which are Rabim Marchikim, also, which are all going to draw a person away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'heim hatavas achumrius, and they all appeal to a person's material self, right? A person has got material needs and material drives and material pleasures and activities and relationships and foods and activities, which all give a person material pleasure. And that's okay, but it's only okay provided it's an experience that brings you closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If it's an experience that takes you further away, then he says, there are some experiences which, if you allow yourself to be drawn afterwards, then you're walking in the opposite direction. You're not going towards Dveikus, you're walking away from a closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The ultimate good of being close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're abandoning it because you're allowing yourself to be distracted by the world. So what's he saying here? He's saying HaKadosh Baruch Hu specifically put us in a world which is tempting us in the wrong direction, right? This is the concept of the Nisoya. And it starts, of course, with Adam and Eve being told, you're being tested not to eat the forbidden fruit from the Eitz Hadat. And that didn't work very well, right? As we all know, right? Didn't have such a great ending. Adam and Chava failed that test. And that story is actually about human nature. And actually human nature is susceptible to failing this test, right? It's amazing when you think about it just for a minute. If you think for a minute about Adam and Eve being given the entire world and the entire Gan Eden, right? And being told, everything's for you. You can have everything and anything you want, except, guess what? There's this one tree. And the fruit of this one tree you can't have. And they failed the test. And it's an extraordinary thing, but the truth is there's something about human nature. Somebody once said to me, let's say somebody puts you in a library where there are 50,000 books. And they say, you're allowed to read every book here. It's all for you. Enjoy yourself, learn and read for the rest of your life. But on the fourth shelf, second from the left, there's one book that you're not allowed to read. That you're not allowed to read. Everything else you can read. What's going to happen? You're going to sit in that room for an hour or two, and at the back of your mind, you're thinking, what is in that book that I'm not allowed to read? There must be something in that book. I wonder what could it possibly be in that book? All these books I can read, and that I can't. There must be something. And the human mind is made like that. It's a perversion of the human mind in a certain sense. That's the minute something becomes forbidden, it becomes in a certain way attractive. We're attracted to certain things which are out of our reach. And that is, and we have to overcome that. That's part of the Yetzer Hara. That's part of what the Moshe Haim Luzzatto calls Rabim HaMarchikim, experiences that will test us, right? And constantly throughout the Tanakh, we are given stories of tests, right? In the Akedas Yitzchak that we're going to read about on Rosh Hashanah, how does the whole Akedas Yitzchak start? It says, Achad Mo'eleh, Mo'elokim Nisa Es Avram. That's the opening pasuk to the Akedah. God is testing Avram. Why is God testing Avram? God doesn't need to test anybody. The Ramban asked the question. He doesn't need to test. He knows exactly what Avram's capable of or not. But the tests are designed to develop the human being and develop our neshama. By being tested and grappling with the test and coming out of it in a positive way, that is spiritual growth. That, says the Ramchal, is the key to spiritual growth, is to understand the idea of the nisayon. So let's see inside how he expresses this. So he says here, V'nimtza, says the Ramchal. Everybody with me? V'nimtza. So we see shehu musam be'emes b'tocha milchama hachazaka. This is the Mesillat Yesharim depicting everybody's life He said everybody's life without exception is in a challenging situation. We are constantly being challenged. It doesn't matter whether we are wealthy or we are poor, whether with children, without children, we're young, whether we're old, whether we're healthy or unhealthy. Every situation is a challenge. It's a challenge to see, are we in this situation going to find a way to get a bit closer to Dveikus and HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Everything is a challenge. So he says, look how he explains it. Ki kol inyonei ha'olam, everything in this world, bein l'tov, bein l'ra, whether you think they're good or they're bad, hinei heim nisyonos la'odam, they are tests for a person. A person is in a difficult situation, that's a test. But even when he's in a fantastic situation, look what he writes here. Ha'oni mitzad echad, poverty is a great test. A person is suffering from poverty. Sadly, throughout Jewish history, most of Klal Yisrael, most of the time, lived mainly in a state of poverty. There were a few exceptions and a few golden age here and there for a short time, but generally speaking, Klal Yisrael did not live in a state of affluence. The way we live today, in terms of affluence, was unthinkable for our grandparents and great-grandparents, and the poverty was unbelievable. I was recently reading a story, a history book about a town in Lithuania. A historian wrote a book about a little town in Lithuania. I think it was called Aishishok, where in this book documented about 800 years of history of this town in Lita until it was wiped out by the Nazis, and they had lots of diaries and documents about how life was lived there and everything. And in one case, at the beginning of the 20th century, they opened the first Beis Yaakov school for girls. This was unheard of before, a Torah school for teaching girls, and there was a great excitement in the town. They'd never had a school teaching Torah to girls. This was a big chiddush of Sarah Shnira. And she quotes this diary of this family who had 3 daughters, and they were very excited to attend this school. And so, and in the diary it says that they took it in turns, because they lived on the other side of town from this school. They took it in turns to go to the school. These 3 daughters took it in turns. One day one went, the next day, and when you read it, you don't think, well, why didn't they all 3 go together? I don't quite get this. And it turns out afterwards that they had 1 pair of shoes between them. They only had 1 pair of shoes. And that 1 pair of shoes, they were all using the same pair of shoes to walk across town, right? And therefore they could only go, they had to take it in turns to go to the school. And you think to yourself, this is only about, 100 years ago. We're not talking about the Middle Ages or the ancient world. We're talking about the way our grandparents lived and great-grandparents lived in poverty in Europe, many of us, except for maybe the wealthy 2 or 3%. But apart from that, most of them lived really in absolute poverty. Says the Ramchal, poverty is a nisaya, because you're constantly struggling to survive. And to find room in your mind and in your heart and in your neshama for spiritual activity, for dveikus in the times of poverty, is very difficult, right? But now he's going to go on to say, but the truth is, from a spiritual point of view, affluence and wealth is exactly the same test, right? That a person who is wealthy, he is being tested by his wealth, because a person who is wealthy could very easily abandon his Torah and mitzvahs and immerse himself in the pleasures that his wealth brings him. Unfortunately, if you look at the history of the Jews in Europe in the 1800s, right? So you find that at the risk of overgeneralization, but in Western Europe, there was more affluence, and in Eastern Europe, there was more poverty. And in Western Europe, the greater affluence in Germany, in France, in Holland, and England led people to much greater assimilation, a much greater loss of emunah and Yiras Shamayim, much greater loss of Yiddishkeit than in Eastern Europe, where they were still living a life of poverty. Because affluence opens doors to all sorts of new social opportunities and professional opportunities, and financial opportunities, which, you can become a wealthy person. All you need to do is give up Shabbos and give up kashrus. And if you read the story of the Rothschild family, the first generation were all frum people. Uncle Rothschild, living in Frankfurt, was a frum man, davened 3 times a day, gave tzedakah all the time, was a completely frum man. The second generation were still a little bit shomer mitzvahs, but not very intensely so. The third generation were completely assimilated, and the fourth generation were not Jewish anymore. They'd married out. And that story of the Rothschilds is just a microcosm of what was happening in Western Europe. The people who got into affluence, the affluence was too seductive and too attractive, the opportunities for people to say, no, my Shabbos and my Chavrusa and my learning and my Yontef is too important for me to give up. I'm not going to get involved in this business. I'm going to stick with my Torah life. So have a look here how he expresses it, Ramchal, writing 300 years ago. He writes as follows: Ha'oni mitzad echad, poverty at one end of the spectrum, for ha'osher mitzad echad, and affluence at the other end of the spectrum. What's he saying here? Both of them are equally nisyonot. They're both tests. That was wherever a person finds himself on the economic spectrum, wherever you are is a test. I've given you this situation. How are you going to use this? So he says as follows: Shlomo Melech says in Mishlei, Pen espa v'kichashti. If I become satisfied and affluent, then I'm likely to deny my role in this world. V'omarti mi Hashem. And I will say, who is HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I don't need him. I'm safe. I'm satisfied. I'm happy. I don't need any connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says Shlomo Melech. Upen ivoresh, or the other end of the spectrum, if I become poor, v'gonavti, I might have to steal. So the nisyonos are at both ends. Hashal bo mitzad echad, people living peacefully at one end of the spectrum, right, are being tested. You're living peacefully and everything. What are you going to do with your peaceful existence? What are you going to achieve with it? How are you going to help other people? How are you going to help Klal Yisrael? How are you going to become more of a Talmid Chacham? If you're living a peaceful life, the opportunities are all a test. V'hayisurim mitzad echad. And on the other end of the spectrum, chas v'shalom, a person who lives a life of yisurim, of suffering, of pain, of illness, that's also a nisayon. That's equally a test. A person is living, spiritually speaking, in a world which is a battlefield. He uses the word milchama here. Ponim v'ocha, front and back, in other words, to the right and to the left, irrespective of what a person's situation is, that is going to be a test for them. That's a test. And this is one of the key ideas of the Mesillat Yesharim chapter 1, which he develops throughout the whole Sefer. And it's a perspective on life. Whenever a person is in a particular situation, either wow, isn't it a fantastic situation? I've suddenly got a windfall. I've suddenly got an extra amount of money or an extra amount of time or extra amount of energy. That is a test. What are you going to do with it? At the other end, there is chas v'shalom, somebody has a loss or a sadness or a failure in business, and then the question is also a test. Actually, there's an interesting source for this in the Chumash. I like to try and find instances in the Chumash that the Pasuk says in Sefer Devarim about the 40 years in the desert. So it says, HaKadosh Baruch, Moshe Rabbeinu says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu fed you the mon in the desert. Every day you got mon, leman nasoscha, in order to test you. So the question is, what was the test of the mon? What was the test? Does anybody have an idea what they would like to make a comment into the Shia? What do you think was the test with the mon that fell daily? In what way were they being tested? Anybody?
Shabbos.
Say it again.
Shabbos.
Yes, good. Yes. Shabbos was a test, that they don't go collecting it on Shabbos. You're quite right. Anything else?
I think the fact that they had it.
Boredom.
What do you say? Sorry?
Someone said boredom. I'm not sure who it was.
Okay. What did you say, Ami? Did you say something?
I said the fact that they're given things that they would have otherwise had to work for,
Right.
they would still be able to realize that that's what the connection to Hashem to be able to.
It's interesting. You see in the Mefarshim two different schools of thought.
Hmm.
One school of thought is that the test was poverty. Why poverty? Because everybody went to sleep every night and there was no food in the house. You went to sleep every night and there was absolutely nothing in the house at all because the man served you, you ate it during the day and what was left melted, and you went to bed and the cupboard is bare. There's nothing there, nothing in the fridge, nothing in the kitchen. There's nothing there at all, nothing. And you have to have a emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu that tomorrow, that like he created the man yesterday, he'll deliver it tomorrow. But that was a test to have that emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that like we had it yesterday, we're going to have it tomorrow. But the other Mefarshim said the Sforno, for example, says the test was affluence. Why? Because they didn't have to protect themselves from enemies. They were living in the Ananei HaKavod. They didn't have to build buildings or plow the land. They didn't need to make a parnasa. They were actually completely free. They were living on a scholarship, right? They were students living on a scholarship. Some of you might remember those days of a student living on a scholarship where the money arrived in your bank, right, on the on the day, and you didn't have to work for it. And when you don't have to work for it, and you're completely not required to do anything at all to protect yourself or sustain yourself in any way, then the question is, so now what? What are you now going to do with your life? Let's say you've got now 10 million pounds in the bank, you don't need to work at all. What are you going to do now? What are you going to do now? That was the Nisayan. That was the test of affluence. That's not the test of poverty. It's interesting that the mon was given in such a way that it contained both elements of poverty, going to bed with nothing in the house, and elements of affluence, that whenever it fell, that was it. And you were completely looked after. And you could dedicate your whole life, basically, to learning. What were they doing for 40 years in the Midbar? It was one giant kailah. Everybody was sitting and learning. They had shiurim every day from Moshe and Aaron, right, for 40 years. And they were supported by a scholarship. And that was the mon. So, the Pasuk says the mon was leman nasoso, to test you, to see how are you going to deal with a guaranteed supply of protection and of food. How are you going to live with that? So what he wants to say here, the Ramchal is saying this is a perspective on life, he says, which should follow you in every stage of your life. And if you know how to fight this battle, that's what he means here. If you know how to fight this battle, if you're willing to look at every situation through the eyes, this is a test from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Test for my emunah, test for my midas, test for my ability to dedicate myself to something valuable. And you're successful. That is the shleimus that we're going to be talking about in this book. That is the goal that a person can achieve. Becoming an Adam HaShalem is a bit of a deceptive phrase, to become the perfect person. Nobody's perfect. But if a person has this perspective that all different situations are testing, in other words, God is testing. In a sense, one of the beautiful spiritual messages from this Mesillat Yesharim is that, in a sense, he wants you to look at life as a sort of a dialogue between myself and the Rebbeinu Shlomo. He's given me this situation, and by giving me this situation, it's like a question. And the question is, nu, that's a real good Yiddish way of putting this, nu, what are you going to do with this? Right? I've given you this freedom, I've given you this money, I've given you this chas v'shalom difficulties or illness or whatever it is. What are you going to do now? how are you going to use this, right, as a way to get closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So he says, Ve'im yizke, if a person has the zechus, meaning if he has the right mindset, lidovek baboro, to achieve dvekus in all these different tests, then v'yetze min ha-prosdor hazeh, a person will eventually leave this prosdor. What is the prosdor for him? Prosdor is admei v'esrim, right? The years of life in this world, Chazal referred to as a prosdor, as a corridor, meaning it's a preparation, the Yikones Betraklin, and he will enter into the palace, La'or Ba'or HaChayim, and the palace in this sense is his metaphor for Olam Haba. So what he's saying here is, in this world, we need to find pleasure in spiritual achievements, but these spiritual achievements are not simple because they only come through situations which test us, right? We're being tested at every, it's very interesting because when you read the Rambam, this is something a bit unique about the way the Mesillat Yesharim presents it. When you read the Rambam and he speaks about making a bechira, making choices, right? You get the feeling that what he's talking about is that in life there are certain sort of crossroad choices to make in life. You know, are you going to get married to this person or to that person? Are you going to come and live in Israel or not going to come and live in Israel? Are you going to take this job or that job? There are certain crucial acts of bechira that you need to make, and those choices are going to really make your life what it is. And therefore the Rambam is and that's the uvocharto b'chayim, choose the path of chayim, meaning a spiritual life of uvocharto b'chayim. Choose a life of spiritual meaning. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying. But what's interesting in the Ramchal, in Rabbi Moshe Haim Luzzatto, in the Mesillat Yesharim, he is saying that the test isn't only at certain crucial crossroad moments in your life, but every morning when you wake up, every moment of your life is a test, right? You're given a test. Are you going to be able to use this situation? At 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning, you're given a situation. Are you going to use this wisely to bring you a little bit closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through a mitzvah, through a chesed, through a bit of learning, through a tefillah? Or are you going to simply squander it and turn away from it? That is a test. And that's why the Mesillat Yesharim, not everybody likes the Mesillat. I must tell you, I didn't say this to you last year. I didn't want to frighten you off. But not everybody likes the Mesillat Yesharim because it's very intense. The actual message of the Mesillat Yesharim is a very intense message. It tries to encourage the individual to really be focused on his values and goals and attainments like 24/7. From the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, every moment, to try and maximize it and remind yourself of your spiritual goals in life, etc. It's difficult to live like that. And some people who do live like that, it drives them crazy. So I would say to you, it's important to make sure that you take the message of the Mesillat Yesharim, but you don't let it drive you nuts, right? Because once it drives you nuts, then you've lost the whole program, right? It's meant to be done in a gradual way, in an incremental way, slowly train oneself to think in a certain way, try and do it 2 or 3 times a day, and then 4 or 5 times a day, and then try and do it a bit better. But actually, these shiurim are quite well timed, because the truth is, Klal Yisrael have got a minhag that during the Aseres Yemei Teshuvah, we do turn up the volume a little bit on our thinking of what we're doing with our lives. What are we really achieving? Are we really going to attain a greater wisdom and understand the Torah better? Are we going to have better relationships with our wife, our husband, with our children, with our grandchildren? Are we going to have a connection to a Rav who's going to teach us Torah and halacha? Are we going to deepen our Torah life, right? Or are we going to just plan more vacations and have a bit of a more of an easier, relaxed existence. Nothing wrong with relaxing, incidentally, but the question is how to get that balance exactly right. So, but the Mesillat Yesharim does come with a little bit of a health warning written at the bottom, like a packet of cigarettes. The Surgeon General has determined that this can be damaging to your health. The Mesillat Yesharim, if you take it literally and positively, it can be it can lead to a very focused life and a very heavy life, and that's not what he wants. He wants you to get there slowly but surely. He wants you to get into Kita Aleph and then Kita Bet and Kita Gimel. Doesn't want you to dive in and get drowned. But I'm trying to give you the basic building blocks. So just to review for a minute, he starts off by saying to get an idea of chovoso ba'olamo, big picture, that you do have a goal in life, a spiritual goal in life. You're not living a life on autopilot. There is a goal here, right? And then he goes on to say, right, that what is the goal? The goal in some way has to be connected with achieving dveikus, a closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is achieved through mitzvahs. So we're going to try and find a way to maximize mitzvahs in order to achieve that goal. And then he goes on and takes us in to this perspective of looking at life as nisyonos, as a constant series of tests. And each one of these tests is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is asking us, okay, I've given you this situation. What are you going to do with it now? How are you going to now maximize this in order to reach that goal of Dveikus HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How is that going to happen? And this is really, I think, a very, if you really think about it, and I'll share with you one short experience that I had in 1969, I think it was, 1969, 1970. I was a young teenager in yeshiva in Israel, in a yeshiva called Kol Torah. So Kol Torah is a yeshiva in Beit Vegan in Yerushalayim. Some of you are familiar with this. And it's a Haredish yeshiva. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was the man really who changed my life, Shlomo Zalman. I'll speak about that some other time. But Kol Polim, there I was sitting in the Beis HaMedrash, and the way the daily program was structured was there was learning all morning and a shia, a short lunch break, and then learning in the afternoon. And then a half an hour before Ma'ariv, there was Musa learning. And everybody could choose which Musa Sefer they wanted to learn, Shari Tshuva, Chovos and Vavos, but Mesillat Yesharim was the bestseller in the Musa library. That was the, anyhow, why do I mention this to you? Because at that time, some of you might have heard of Rabbi Elia Lopian. Rabbi Elia Lopian was one of the great tzaddikim of the previous generation. He passed away, I think, in 1970 or the early 70s. But in 1968, 69, he was really in his 90s, and he couldn't see very well anymore. He couldn't read Sforim anymore. But every day, when he could, but it was almost every day, he would come into Kol Torah, into the Beis HaMedrash, to daven Ma'ariv with us. But he wouldn't come in for Ma'ariv. He came in for the Musa Seder. And he would sit down on one of the bench. He wouldn't sit at the Mizrach. He wasn't interested in the Mizrach. He would sit on the bench where we were sitting, about 200-300 boys in the Beis HaMedrash. And he couldn't read the Mesillat Yesharim, but he knew it word by word, off by heart. And he would sit there reciting a paragraph from the Mesillat Yesharim with a particular nigun and repeating it again and repeating it again and repeating it again and meditating. It was really a meditational exercise. And to see a man in his 90s, right, who couldn't see anymore, right, but he knew the Mesillat Yesharim off by heart. And he was in a moment, he was actually on a meditational high. I can still see him in front of my eyes. And he was like really chuckling with his Mesillat Yesharim, and he was saying it out loud with his nigun. It was a lesson for everybody. Everybody in the Beis HaMedrash realized that it's time to learn a bit of Musa and to try and get into a habit of learning it off by heart And I remember myself spending a bit of time learning chapter 1 of the Mesillat Yesharim until I knew it off by heart. I remember that was an exercise that we engaged in at the time, to know it off by heart, that you could say it off by heart and say it again and again. It is it's a way of thinking. It's a way of life. I remember when he came to Ma'ariv, actually, he used to go up and stand, because he couldn't hear very well either. He would go and stand next to the Shliach Tzibur, right 1 inch away from the Shliach Tzibur, in order to say Amen, Yehei Shmei Rabba. He would stand right there in the front of the Beis HaMedrash. But while he was learning Musa, he would sit on a benkel together with all the other boys. And it's a vision that I will never forget. And I was zeicher to be at his levaya also. I think it was the early 70s, I seem to remember. It was in Beit Vegan. And I can tell you just one little anecdote, and with this we'll finish the share for today, but it's an anecdote which I think you'll appreciate. So at this levaya, you can imagine several of the Gedolei Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael gave Hespedim. And it was a hot day, and there were thousands of people, and they had a PA system, they had loudspeakers on Rehov HaPiska, Rehov Beit Vegan, and it was a big crowd. And I said, I don't remember what anybody said except for one hesped. There was one hesped which was unforgettable, which lasted about 60 seconds. Sometimes the short ones are the most focused. And this was Reb Chaim Shmulevitz. Zeicher Tzadik Livracha. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, I didn't know him yet. I wasn't yet in the Mir Yeshiva, but he was well known in Yerushalayim as the Rosh Yeshiva of Yerushalayim. Chaim Shmulevitz got up and he spoke in Yiddish. And what he said was, Rabbi Sai, you don't know who we have lost today. Let me tell you who we've lost. So he said, 6 years ago, I think he said 6, 7 years ago, I was ill. He said, I was ill. And Bashamayim, it was paskened that I should die. Right. And then he said, Via zoi veisich, how do I know that? And he gave a clap on the stender. Ich weiß. I know, there are certain things that I know. Bashamayim was paskened that I should die. And it was only the tefillas of Rabbi Elia that saved my life. How do I know that? He said, Via zoi veisich, ich weiß. And that was it. That was the end of the hesped. He sat down. And everybody was like looking at each other like, what just happened? It was an extraordinary hesped I ever heard in my life. It was like literally a 60-second hesped. He was telling us the tefillas of Rabbi Elia Lopian reached Bashamayim, saved my life, and I wanted to make a hesped to tell you all who this man was. Okay, so this was Rabbi Elia Lopian, whose life was guided by the Mesillat Yesharim, for whom the Mesillat Yesharim was something which every day he reviewed and meditated on and reflected on. So I'm just saying to you, this Sefer is something worth learning through. And Baruch Hashem, today we've managed to do another little bit of it. And please God, we have a third Shia, don't we, Ami? When is the third Shia? I don't remember exactly when it's
Monday night, the 12th.
Monday night, the 12th, ladies and gentlemen, Monday night, the 12th at 8:30.
Monday the 13th, I think it is actually.
Sorry, yes.
What do you say?
Am I right? No. Yeah, Monday
the 13th. Sorry, yes, you're correct.
Monday night, the 13th.
Sorry.
Monday night, the 13th?
Yeah.
Yes, is that right? Okay, let me just see here.
And we will all know the first chapter off by heart by then.
Monday night, you'll all be tested. You'll all be tested on the first half of chapter 1. In the meantime, I want to wish you a Shana Tova Umuvureches, a good gebenchte Yah. Please God, it should be a year of only bracha, of good health, of hatzlacha. And this is my bracha. My bracha is that next year, when we get together on Rosh Hashanah, I will say to you, do you remember last year there was this COVID virus thing? And you'll say, nah, I don't remember that at all. It must have been just a bad dream. That was just something which was, you dreamed it out. It will be long forgotten. By the time we get to next Rosh Hashanah, it'll all be long forgotten. Bez Hashem. And I wish you all a good gebenched Yah. And please God, we'll get together in, what is that, in about 2 weeks' time, a bit less than 2 weeks' time. All the very best.
Thank you.
And only a year of Yeshuas, of brachas, and atzlacha. All the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Nice to see you all.
It was nice